Resuming debate, reprise du débat, the honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We're here tonight to talk about a serious charge made by the former Attorney General at committee yesterday. At committee, she said, and I quote, "For a period of approximately 4 months between September and December 2018, I experienced a consistent and sustained effort by many people within the government to seek to politically interfere in the exercise of prosecutorial discretion in my role as the Attorney General of Canada in an inappropriate effort to secure a deferred prosecution agreement with SNC-Lavalin." It's a pretty serious charge, Mr. Speaker, and at the heart of that charge is a company that, yes, employs many people, and we're grateful for good jobs in Canada, but that's not a free pass to do whatever the company would like, and this is a company whose boardroom has a checkered past. So for instance, Mr. Speaker, SNC-Lavalin has been banned by the World Bank from bidding on contracts for 10 years after investigations that it undertook for bribery schemes in Bangladesh and Cambodia. Recently, a former SNC-Lavalin executive pleaded guilty to breaking election laws to funnel tens of thousands of dollars into the coffers of both Liberal and the Conservative Party, Mr. Speaker. It's a company that in 2011 was able to buy Atomic Energy Canada's commercial operations for only $15 million, including the plans to the CANDU reactor, and at the same time got a guarantee of $75 million worth of contracts for the work, which more than pays for the price that they paid for an important Canadian asset, which are the plans for the CANDU reactor. Currently, SNC is part of a consortium that stands to benefit from a multi-billion-dollar capital project right here in downtown Ottawa with the privatization of the operations of a heating and cooling plant that serves many buildings downtown, including the very building that we're in right now, Mr. Speaker. And now we hear of political interference on behalf or by the Prime Minister on their behalf, not for the workers, Mr. Speaker, but for their executives and to help them escape these criminal charges, Mr. Speaker, and I'll have more to say about that further on in my remarks. So in response to this testimony that we heard from the former Attorney General, that there was a sustained effort to pressure her inappropriately into changing her position, the NDP has called for the Prime Minister to waive cabinet confidence for the period after she was fired from the position of Attorney General while she was still in cabinet, because that was not waived, and she was very clear at committee that there are elements to the story that bear on her ultimate decision to resign from cabinet that she's not able to tell because they continue to be covered under those confidences. We've also asked that the Justice Committee hear from the 11 people that the MP for Vancouver-Granville named as part of the pressure campaign, which includes the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, and certainly he has details about what went on that Canadians would like to know and that are essential to being able to understand the nature of what's transpired. So he ought to appear before committee. And we've also called, and we called for this some time ago when the story broke, and renewed our call for a full public inquiry, because there's a lot of moving parts to this story. I don't think that comes as a surprise to anybody here. There are new revelations, it seems, almost every day, Mr. Speaker, and the scope of the current investigations are simply not adequate to the task of understanding the entirety of what's going on. Each investigation may bear important fruit in terms of figuring out a piece of the puzzle, but by no means can any one of the existing investigations tell the whole story, and that's why it's important that we have a public inquiry. Why is it important to get to the bottom of this, Mr. Speaker? Well, I think anyone who's ever been pressured or bullied into doing something that they thought was a bad idea probably have a sense of what's wrong with this picture. Anyone who's been pressured or bullied, especially by someone in a position of authority over them, will have an even better idea. So maybe it's a supervisor at work who can terminate your position and take away your salary, or a landlord who governs whether or not you can stay in your unit. A parole officer, a team coach. These are people in positions of authority, and by and large, people who occupy those positions do a good job, and they're leaders in our community. But when people in those kinds of positions decide to abuse that power and authority, it's an awful feeling to be subject to that. It's ugly, and it's wrong, Mr. Speaker. The allegation is that the Prime Minister, his principal secretary, his chief of staff, and the clerk of the Privy Council, who all have a lot of authority and power, did just such a thing, Mr. Speaker. According to the former Attorney General, as I said, they used that power to inappropriately pressure her to reverse a decision of the Director of Public Prosecutions in order to get a corporation charged with bribery of public officials out of facing criminal charges. The Prime Minister wants to chalk that up to a difference of perspectives, and he wants to put his word up against hers. But I think anyone who watched the testimony yesterday will have seen that the member for Vancouver-Granville offered a calm, consistent, well-documented testimony, and she embodied everything you would expect in a credible witness. I believe her testimony, and I encourage any Canadians listening at home to watch it for themselves if they have any doubt, Mr. Speaker. While she and I disagree on a number of policy matters, and we've had disagreements in this House, I do respect her integrity, and I think she set an example for us all in the way that she's conducted herself in a very difficult situation. And that example stands for all of us, whatever our political stripe, Mr. Speaker. She was taking decisions that were hers to take. It was a decision not of the Prime Minister, but of the Attorney General, whether or not to negotiate a deferred prosecution agreement. And when she said that she had made up her mind and the decision was taken, because it wasn't inappropriate initially for the Prime Minister to have some conversation with her about the economic impact of these things. That's part of good policy making and good decision making, frankly, Mr. Speaker. But when she said that she had considered those things and she had made up her mind, that ought to have been the end of it, Mr. Speaker. And we didn't hear in her testimony that when the Prime Minister and various officials at the top levels of government kept coming back at her and her staff in her office to try and convince them to change this decision, that they were presenting any new information, Mr. Speaker. We didn't hear that from her. Perhaps if the Prime Minister would like to come to the committee and testify, then he could tell us what new information he was offering her. But that's not what we've heard, Mr. Speaker. We've heard that they were coming with similar arguments and veiled threats in order to get her to change her mind. And she stood up to the Prime Minister and his team for the sake of an important principle, which is the rule of law, Mr. Speaker. So why is that important? Well, the rule of law gives us rights, Mr. Speaker. It's what protects us from the egomaniacs and bullies that sometimes make it into positions of power. As Canadians, we're entitled to a fair hearing and equal treatment before the law. You can contrast that with other places in the world today or in times past where people live or lived in fear of the whims of people at the top. We've passed laws over time to build a system that protects Canadians from that kind of arbitrary treatment. But there's no law you can pass that can guarantee that forever, Mr. Speaker. Protecting our rights, just like protecting our democracy, is a job that's never done, and it's why moments like this are so important, Mr. Speaker. The rule of law and democracy also have an important cultural component. You have to build a culture of respect for rules and due process in your institutions if you want to safeguard democracy and the rule of law. The higher up the food chain you go, the more power you have, the more important it is for democracy and the rule of law that you conduct yourself according to the highest ethical standard and in respect of those rules. I believe the member for Vancouver-Granville lived up to her duty in that regard, but based on her testimony yesterday, I believe the Prime Minister and his team fell far short of that mark. On December 5th, in a meeting with the former PMO, Principal Secretary Jerry Butts, he is alleged to have said by the former Attorney General to her staff that he talked to her Chief of Staff about how the statute was set up by Harper and that he doesn't like the law, as if that were relevant. In a December 18th meeting, Jerry Butts and the PMO Chief of Staff, Katie Telford, told Jessica Prince in the former Attorney General's office that a resolution to the DPA situation was necessary. He stated, "Jess, there's no solution here that doesn't involve some interference." Telford stated, "We don't want to debate legalities anymore." That's from the member for Vancouver-Granville's testimony yesterday. A December 19th phone call between the former Attorney General and the Clerk of the Privy Council, the clerk stated, "I think that he, the Prime Minister, is going to find a way to get it done one way or another, so he's in that kind of mood and I wanted you to be aware of that." He also told the former Attorney General, "You don't want to be on a collision course with this Prime Minister." For some reason, the Prime Minister felt that he could override the independence of the Attorney General. Perhaps that should not come as a surprise, Mr. Speaker. He was, after all, the first Canadian Prime Minister to be found guilty of ethics violations by the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner. We know that the Liberals, when it was KPMG that ran into trouble, were willing to cut a secret deal when KPMG was found to have devised a tax dodging scheme. So their clients, all they had to do was pay the taxes they owed without penalties. They got amnesty and secrecy around most of the terms of their settlement. It's the government that made a science of cash for access fundraising, Mr. Speaker, which has a whole world of ethical problems in and of itself. And it's something you have to watch out for, because a culture of entitlement like that can easily slip into habits of corruption, and that's why it's important to be vigilant. And it's why it's important that we get to the bottom of what happened. It's why it's so important that the former Attorney General be able to tell her full story, which is why it's important that the Prime Minister waive the rules of cabinet confidence for the period, not just that she was the former Attorney General, which has been done, but also for the period that she was the Veteran Affairs Minister. She made it clear in her testimony that, that there are things she can't say about her ultimate decision to resign from cabinet because of something, presumably a conversation or something else that happened between the time that she took the job as Veteran Affairs Minister and the time that she resigned from cabinet. It's also why it's so important that we have a full public inquiry and get to the bottom of what happened. Now I want to take some time, Mr. Speaker, having established the importance of the issue, I think, to address some of the arguments that I've heard from Liberal members in the chamber today. They say, well, you know, really the opposition shouldn't be concerned about this because we have an investigation happening at the Justice Committee. And I respect that the Justice Committee has a job to do. I would say that the scope of the study they've selected is already too narrow to capture everything that is going on. There's just within the scope of the study that they selected, you are not going to get to the bottom of all of the allegations that have come out within the testimony. And I do think, Mr. Speaker, it needs to be said that there is a fundamental political conflict of interest leaving that investigation to a committee that's dominated by Liberals who have a clear political interest in the problem going away and not ultimately hurting the Prime Minister. And the fact that so many Liberals seem to be blind to that fact or don't really see a problem with that or understand why people would have legitimate concerns about that being the principal forum for getting to the bottom of this, I think is very telling in terms of how the government got into this kind of trouble in the first place. They just don't seem to be able to identify these kinds of obvious conflicts, or at the very least apparent conflicts. And when you're pursuing the highest ethical standard, as the Prime Minister told his ministers in his mandate letter that he wanted to do and that he told Canadians he wanted to do in the 2015 election, apparent conflicts of interest are just as important as actual conflicts of interest. And there's certainly an apparent conflict of interest with the idea that 6 Liberal members of Parliament are going to be the final adjudicator on the story of what's happened in this case, Mr. Speaker. They've also said that the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner is running an investigation, so we shouldn't be concerned. We shouldn't have any extra questions that he's going to decide everything. Well, we're quite aware of that. In fact, it was the NDP that requested that investigation. And it's not that we don't have confidence in the Commissioner, that we want a public inquiry. It's not that we don't think that there is some value to the investigation that's going on. It's that that investigation as well is limited in scope. It's limited by the very rules that set up the office of the Commissioner and give him his powers and responsibilities. So there's no way that that report is going to get to the bottom of all of what we have heard, because these allegations of political interference fall outside the narrow scope of the Conflict of Interest Commissioner, who's understood to be looking into conflicts of interest as they pertain to the direct financial interests of a member of the House. Well, we'll be interested to hear the conclusion of his investigation, but there's certainly a lot more going on here than that, Mr. Speaker. They also say we shouldn't worry because the Director of Public Prosecutions has said that she made an independent decision. Well, no one has ever doubted that she made an independent decision. The problem wasn't that somehow her decision wasn't independent. The problem was that after that decision was taken, political actors, including the Prime Minister, and those in his office sought to reverse that decision. And they didn't just do it with a one-off conversation with the Attorney General. They had a coordinated pressure campaign in order to try and reverse that decision, Mr. Speaker. That's the problem. So please, let's not have anybody get up and say, well, the Director of Public Prosecution said that she made her decision independently. Of course she did. The question is whether then, for political reasons, someone else sought to overturn that decision. I've heard Liberals stand up today and say that the Prime Minister told the Attorney General that it was her decision at the time, and so there's nothing to see here and don't worry. Well, I don't doubt that he did. That's a pretty good way to cover his behind, Mr. Speaker. And I can believe that she even took him at his word at the time. And that's what she said in testimony, that she did take him at his word at the time. But I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, when she got fired from the position, that probably changed her point of view about the conversations that she had, where she was being told that it really was her decision and hers alone. Because when she made the decision that the Prime Minister clearly didn't want, she lost the job. And that kind of casts a whole new light on the conversations that had been had up to then, and that she may reasonably have thought were sincere. We've also been told that, you know, we should be quiet because the Prime Minister gave her a waiver on solicitor-client privilege, and he gave her a waiver on cabinet confidentiality. But the thing that leaves out is the fact that that waiver on cabinet confidentiality does not cover the period that she was in cabinet between when she was fired from her job as Attorney General and took a job as the Veteran Affairs Minister, and when she chose to resign. And she was very clear at committee that there are aspects of the story she is unable to tell because presumably something happened in that period that made her change her mind. And if we're going to get to the bottom of this, then we need to know exactly what that is. And when my colleague from Victoria presented a motion yesterday at committee simply asking that the Justice Committee request of the Prime Minister, it doesn't have any power to compel the Prime Minister to waive cabinet confidentiality, so just that it request that that confidentiality be waived. I watched as each Liberal member of that committee voted the motion down and refused to at least ask the Prime Minister to take it upon himself to liberate the former Attorney General and tell her full story. So lastly, Mr. Speaker, I know I only have a few minutes left. I want to talk about probably the principal argument that we've heard in this place in terms of the Liberals' defense, which is, you know, jobs, 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 and we want to save the jobs. And everybody here has an interest in seeing Canadians employed, but that doesn't mean that anything goes. It can't be a get-out-of-jail-free card. It can't be that if you're big enough and you employ enough people, you can go out and bribe public officials and get off the hook, Mr. Speaker. That is completely inappropriate. And so, you know, and then, so, you know, was it about the workers? Was it about the jobs? Well, when we heard from the former Attorney General that the Prime Minister was raising political concerns about the fact that he was an MP from Papineau and there was a Quebec election and something had to get done about this, that's not about the workers. That's not about their jobs. That's about the political interests of the Prime Minister and the Liberal Party. That's what that's about, Mr. Speaker, and it's got very little to do with the workers. I'll tell you what could have, and they're pursuing this too, Mr. Speaker, reforming the integrity regime that has the 10-year ban on contracts also would have been an option, and it is in fact an option that they're pursuing. And I dare say, Mr. Speaker, that is the appropriate option, where they look at not inappropriate pressure to abandon criminal charges, but look at the sanctions regime and maybe change it. That's where the conversation should have happened. They have prejudiced and sullied that conversation, because now I think no matter what they do, it's going to look like, and I think it does look like, they're exercising all the options and pulling out all the stops to help get SNC-Lavalin off the hook. I had the Minister of Public Services and Procurement at committee yesterday, and I asked her the simple question many times. Would you say that the bribery of public officials is a serious offense? And will it be treated as a serious offense in the new integrity policy? You know what she told me, Mr. Speaker? She said that the government doesn't have a position on the hierarchy of offenses. That's what she said. She refused to say, as the minister who oversees the largest capital budget in government, she refused to say that she thought the bribery of public officials was a serious offense. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. And it's a testament to how deep the desire to help out this company goes in the government, and how fearful people on the other benches are of doing anything that could undermine the interests of that company, Mr. Speaker. And I hope in the question and answers I get a little more chance to talk about workers and the record of this government when it comes to workers, because I'll tell you, I saw one of the first bills passed in this place, Bill C-10 with time allocation and everything else. That was a bill to change the law to allow Air Canada to outsource its maintenance work for the aerospace industry out of the country. Out of the country. Indeed, out of the country, Mr. Speaker. And I've got a few more examples, so hopefully in question and answer I'll get a chance to address them.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Spadina, Fort York.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate that when the focus is put on saving jobs instead of protecting people, it's an inappropriate way of phrasing the argument. And I think we all understand that from the reading of the law. But I also categorically reject this phrase, get out of jail free, because a deferred prosecution agreement does not suspend a criminal charge. It defers the prosecution if the penalties are not adhered to. In other words, the charge stays, a settlement is negotiated. It's tantamount to a plea bargaining situation within a court, except the difference here is that the charges aren't discharged, they stay on the record, and every single one of the punishments that the party must submit to and admit to because of its guilt is part of the process. So there is no removal of a criminal process, and there is no get out of jail card contemplated in a deferred prosecution agreement. The member opposite has a responsibility to reflect that law properly and not to confuse Canadians.
Member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, I also have a responsibility to represent the views of my constituents, who I think often find that when big companies and rich executives face criminal charges, that whenever they get some kind of plea deal, while it may sound like a lot of money to people who are making $30,000 or $40,000 a year, everybody knows that what they get charged is a drop in the bucket. And as far as they're concerned, it's a slap on the wrist, and in some cases they go on continuing to do exactly the same kind of behavior. That's why the integrity regime was brought in. It was brought in to give teeth and meaningful consequences to corporations who until then were paying fines and getting slaps on the wrist. And it was a decision to try and get serious about this kind of stuff, which we have to do if we want Canadian corporations to go out in the world and conduct business in the way that I think all Canadians expect, and in a way that doesn't put the jobs and the lives of their workers on the line. That was a decision that was made at the corporate board table, and Canadian executives need to know that there's going to be punishments for that. And if they know that and they start behaving, then we're not going to have situations where their bad behavior puts the lives of others in jeopardy, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable member for North Okanagan-Shuswap.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the intervention from the member from Elmwood-Strathcona tonight, and also the intervention previously from the member from Spadina, Fort York. And I want to combine the two of them, actually, because the member from Spadina, Fort York, initially started out his intervention giving quite a bit of praise to the former Attorney General and her credibility and the work she had done, and believed in what she had done. But then he also stated that he supported his Prime Minister. And then we turn to the member from Elmwood-Strathcona, and he's talking about things being unbelievable here tonight. So I want to combine those two interventions and ask the member from Elmwood-Strathcona, who is to be believed here? Is it the former Attorney General, or is it the Prime Minister who denies everything that she has said in testimony, very calmly, very collectively, with credibility and with backup? Who do you think we should believe in this?
The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm always pleased to get up and speak on behalf of people in Elmwood-Transcona in this place. Yeah, I mean, look, I watched a considerable amount of the testimony yesterday. I went down to the Justice Committee room because I was interested, and in part because I wanted to get a feel for the credibility of the witness. And I have to say, I was impressed, not just at her delivery, but I mean, this is a person who's citing text messages and other documentation, who took copious notes, who isn't, flying by the seat of her pants on this at all, as you would expect of professional of her caliber. And it was an interesting contrast to seeing the Prime Minister at a press conference this morning just kind of say, well, I totally disagree with her characterization of events. What I would like to know is what the Prime Minister can tell us that's different about those conversations. What are the other facts that she missed? He didn't say, well, you know, in such and such a meeting, I actually also said this, or I didn't say that, or I said it with this tone. There was no effort at all to try and give Canadians any idea as to what was different about those events such that we would prefer his account. In fact, we don't really have an account of those events from him, which is part of the problem and why we want to see him appear at the Justice Committee and give his account of events so that they can be compared. But I'll tell you, in the absence of him providing that, you have a really credible witness who was well prepared and gave a very believable story. And I don't see any reason to believe the Prime Minister over her until he offers us a lot more.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Kootenay-Columbia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, for the last 5 hours, I guess we've been here tonight, everyone expressing their disappointment at having to be here to begin with. And what Canadians really want to know is the truth. And they want a process that they can believe in that leads us to the truth, because we've heard a lot of interpretations of testimony depending on which side of the floor you're sitting on. So I'd like to ask my colleague, what's the best way to actually get at the truth and give Canadians a sense of confidence that the process will lead to the truth?
Honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, I want to thank the member from Kootenay-Columbia for his question. And I think the answer is pretty obvious. It's to have a full public inquiry. We need somebody who's independent in order to investigate these matters. Now, we have the Ethics Commissioner who is doing some of that, but under a very limited scope. So we need an independent investigator who has a broad mandate in order to chase down all of the different leads and, you know, different corners and twists and turns that this story has taken. And I think only if we have that are people going to be satisfied that we're actually getting to the bottom of what's going on and that we're getting the truth. And trying to distract from the need for a public inquiry to get to that truth because using jobs as an excuse not to get to the bottom of what happened is a mistake, and it's a little hard to take. As I say, from a party who I watched ram through a bill to help outsource the maintenance work of Air Canada workers. A party that I saw, railroad workers with back-to-work legislation, who were on a simple rotating strike, going out just a few days a month. And they said it was a crisis, and they had to legislate them back to work. This is a government that's done damage to workers not just by commission, but by omission, by rolling over when GM said that they were going to shut down an award-winning productive plant and move that work out of the country. It's a government that stood silent while a Crown Corporation ordered a whole bunch of rail cars from a German company producing them in the United States instead of requiring any percentage of Canadian content. It's a government that still, after years of promising, has refused to change the legislative regime to protect the pensions of workers when their company goes bankrupt. I'm thinking of Sears, I'm thinking of Stelco workers, I'm thinking of others, Mr. Speaker, that have watched their pensions disappear. So if you want to talk about jobs, Mr. Speaker, I'd be happy to have a whole other debate about jobs and what this government could be doing to save a lot of jobs and save the pensions of a lot of Canadians. The fact is, it ain't happening, and these jobs came up to cover what they're doing for the corporate buddies in a boardroom, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. We have time for about a 45-second question, 45-second answer. L'honorable député de Vimy.
Dieu merci, nous vivons dans un pays qui est régi par la primauté des lois. Donc, je ne suis pas avocate, Monsieur le Président, mais je trouve qu'après tout ce que j'ai écouté des membres de l'autre côté de notre Chambre, que cette discussion-là sont vraiment, c'est sain d'écouter des débats dans notre institution démocratique. Mais j'ai une question à un autre député qui vient de parler. Ne trouve-t-il pas sage qu'on attende un peu? Qu'est-ce que le commissaire à l'éthique au conflit d'intérêts a à nous dire et d'attendre aussi des témoignages au comité de la justice avant de sortir aux conclusions et de lancer des spéculations pour voir qu'est-ce qu'ils ont à nous dire parce que je pense que des discussions robustes concernant SNC-Lavalin, qui est une des entreprises les plus renommées au monde en génie de la construction, qui embauche et qui emploie 9 000 emplois directs au Canada. Direct, quand je dis des emplois directs, c'est peut-être avec les autres emplois, ça serait 30 000 emplois indirects et dont 3 500 au Québec. Moi, dans mon comté de Vimy, à Laval, j'en ai des centaines d'emplois qui vont être perdus si jamais on ne fait pas de possibilités de discussion pour un accord de remédiation pour SNC-Lavalin. Ne trouve-t-il pas que c'est sain?
The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona in 45 seconds or less, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Les concerns dont j'ai soulevés ont été soulevés pour faire une justification pour une enquête publique. Et une enquête publique ne nous donnera ses réponses à ces questions. Je ne pense pas qu'on a besoin d'attendre la fin de l'enquête du commissaire parce que nous sachons déjà que son mandat est trop limité pour adresser toutes les questions. On veut savoir qu'est-ce qu'il a à dire, mais on sait déjà à cause de son mandat qu'il ne pourrait pas répondre à toutes les questions. Alors, nous voulons une enquête publique pour être capable d'avoir des réponses à toutes ces questions. Le témoignage qui pourrait se passer à la comité de justice et n'est pas garanti à se passer, pourrait se passer dans le contexte d'une enquête publique.
Comme il est minuit, je déclare la motion adoptée. La Chambre demeure donc ajournée jusqu'à plus tard aujourd'hui à 10 heures, conformément à l'article 24.1 du règlement.